What do the 1660s, the 1830s, the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 1980s have in common? Is it the sleeves? When I first started sewing, sleeves scared me. They seemed like they were really complicated. But when I finally made something that had puff sleeves in it, it was this pirate shirt. This is basically a version of an 18th century menswear undershirt, which was worn by most of the people who identified as male. This one was actually made from an old bedsheet that was donated to my mask making endeavors at the beginning of COVID. So how many of you guys here are wearing a cotton t-shirt? Can I get like a show of hands? That's a lot of you. Yeah, okay. So it takes 2,700 gallons of water to make one cotton t-shirt. And that's a lot of water. So there's three kinds of fibers. There's synthetic fibers, there's semi-synthetic fibers, and there's natural fibers. Synthetic fibers come from plastic. These they don't break down into anything but microplastics. Semi-synthetic fibers originally do come from plants, like they come from like trees, but they've been heavily processed with chemicals, and so they do leave behind a heavy chemical residue when they break down. Natural fibers have been used to make clothes since people have been wearing clothes, and they break down completely. So when people first started wearing clothes, all clothes were made out of natural fibers, and from the 12th to the 15th century, fashion trends didn't change very much because of the energy used to make fabric. Everything was hand woven, hand dyed, hand sewn into garments. This took hundreds of hours. With several inventions, like the sewing machine and different weaving machines, this process was sped up. But fabric still held a lot of value. People used to remake their clothes and reuse the fabric to make new clothes instead of weaving new fabric, because the process of making the fabric was much more resource intensive than the process of remaking an old garment into a new garment. From the 1660s, people were amassing enough wealth to afford the extra few yards of fabric it takes to make puffed sleeves. But then, of course, they deflated, like all fashion trends. Fashion trends come and go. But the puffed sleeves came back a couple times. In the 1830s, they came back with as a cotton print, which was really interesting because it had been mostly silks before that. In the 1890s, it went back to silk, and more sheer silks and different kinds of fabrics. In the 1930s, it was more drapey fabrics, which was really interesting. In the 1980s, of course, though, it was very synthetic heavy and all polyester, and that was because that was the most common fabric of the time. It's still, most of your closet is still plastic. So what is fast fashion? Fast fashion is this idea of the fashion industry speeding up exponentially. So again, from the 12th to the 15th century, the fashion silhouettes didn't change very much. But slowly, fashion sped up, and today, there are new trends every week, every few days even, as opposed to trends lasting centuries or even decades. So fast fashion is a problem for many reasons. Workers can be paid less than $1 a day, or different wages that keep them below the poverty line. Also, there's ethical issues with bigger companies stealing smaller companies' designs, and there's no legal repercussions for any of this. Also, the environmental impact of fast fashion means that fast fashion is the second worst polluter, right behind oil. Also, it takes a lot of water and energy to make clothes. with polyester clothes and other synthetic fibers becoming clothes, it takes a lot of energy to make that from the plastic into the clothes. But with cotton, it just takes a lot of water. So what were some of the things that people used to do in history? People used to remake their clothes. People used to piece the fabric so that it would fit into the shapes that it needed to be to make it into clothes. So today, a lot of people, myself included, are following the trend of history bounding. This basically means that we're using different historical styles and historical inspirations to make our own clothes. For example, this is inspired by the 18th century. It's a pocket, and it's pieced. I've used different scraps of fabric to make it. And I have worn it in a lot of those outfits. But something to remember is that fashion trends come and go. But when you find your own personal style, that can last forever. Thank you.